Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and with us today is a writer, instructor, and speaker specializing in personal development, philosophy, history, and science. Thomas Walker-Werth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So my brief introduction really doesn't do you justice. Tell us a little about yourself, and I'm especially interested about when and why you were attracted to Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism.
Sure. Well, I grew up in England, as my voice probably demonstrates, and I went to a grammar school, which is a kind of fairly fancy school. But even there, as a kid who grew up as a Star Trek fan, like I was really interested in science, space, logic, all these sorts of philosophical questions that Star Trek explores. I was kind of on the fringe of society there. I was a bit left out. And I kind of found my solace initially by watching things like Star Trek. And that got me really interested in philosophy and also really interested in the idea of reason. So I kind of credit Star Trek with getting me interested in rationality more broadly. And also my dad. My dad raised me to be a critical thinker. He always sort of pushed the idea on me that I should come to my own conclusions about everything. I shouldn't accept his or anyone else's instruction on what I should believe. So I went in with this really critical thinking mindset. And I was also trying to wrestle with the fact that most of the people around me didn't share that mindset. And Star Trek presented this kind of more rational, more flourishing future. And also through the example of the Vulcans in Star Trek, this kind of logical society where everyone's interested in science and reason. And so that idea really resonated with me. And then as I got a bit older, I started getting into a lot of debates with kids about religion. And also we had like religious education at my school. And so I got thinking about religion, and these ideas made no sense to me, and I sort of rejected them quite strongly. And I got really interested in the new atheist movement for a while, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, people like that. And they kind of introduced me to some broader philosophy that I hadn't considered before. I went to some Sam Harris talks and things like that as well. And that just kind of carried on in the background while I got more and more interested in politics. I started reading a lot about politics. And I basically ended up having these disparate ideas, a few theories about politics, a few things about with the origins of the universe and stuff like that. I never really connected them to each other. I started forming a lot of different views in different areas, but I didn't integrate them at all. And then one day I was watching a Christopher Hitchens video on YouTube. This is back in 2012, I think, maybe 2013. And in the recommended section at the side of YouTube, it popped up this black and white interview with this lady called Ayn Rand. And I had no idea who she was, no idea about anything, but I was in one of those moods I get in where I just want to learn stuff. So I clicked on it and thought, oh, let's just see what this is all about. And it was Ayn Rand's 1957 interview with Mike Wallace. I'm sure if you're an objectivist, you've probably seen it. And right at the start of that interview, she says that like the core of her philosophy is that man's rational mind is his means of dealing with reality. Like our means of knowing what's true and of working out what to do in life is reason. And I was like, yes, 100%. That's what I believe. That's what I've always believed. That's what I want to find people who explain that to me and help me apply that principle. And then she just went on to hit thing after thing that I had already kind of worked out one way or another, but hadn't connected to the rest of my philosophy. And she basically tied all my existing ideas together into a coherent framework. So I'd already come to the conclusion that government shouldn't run education because I hated the way that at my school I had this government curriculum forced down my throat. I was taught this. I went to school when Tony Blair was prime minister in the UK. It was multiculturalism was being thrown at me and environmentalism was being thrown at me. And God, it's probably worse now, but it was bad in the mid 2000s. And I just felt I was being indoctrinated to believe this stuff, whether it was true or not. That wasn't the important thing. The important thing was that I was being forced to like accept these ideas. It wasn't a question or a debate. It was just, this is true and accept it. And so I wanted the government out of education. And she talked about that. And then I'm also a big transportation enthusiast. I really like railroads and airplanes and stuff like that. And from my interest in that field, I had seen how the sort of partial privatization of the railroads, trains in this country had improved them in a lot of ways and might have improved them further if it had been done more consistently. And she talked about that and the idea of private roads. And I was like, yes, 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 all the way through this interview. So that sent me off on this rabbit hole of discovering objectivism. I watched a lot of sort of modern objectivist thinkers, as well as a lot more of Rand's interviews and things like that. And sort of rapidly realized that to understand these ideas properly, I'd have to read her. So I read The Fountainhead, I read Anthem, and then I read Atlas Shrugged. I interned at the Ayn Rand Institute. I went to a lot of their conferences for a long time. Actually, I worked with Ayn Rand Institute Europe for a while, and gradually built up more and more of an understanding of objectivism, of what it meant to me, and also kind of what the movement was perhaps lacking in certain respects, what we needed to do to get these ideas out into the public more. Because my mission here the whole time has been kind of to bring human civilization and Western civilization more to the principles of reason, like to a more rational, more life-supporting situation. And so for a long time, I think objectivism has been this kind of small clique of people who already agree on their basic premises. And I really wanted to change that. I really wanted to spread it out to the general masses, to the kind of people I went to school with and went to university with. So I started to realize that I needed to go in a new direction to achieve that more. I started working with the Objective Standard and Objective Standard Institute, who I think are sort of working in that direction. And I love what we're doing at OSI. But I've also more recently realized that I want to do something more specific, which is to really provide the most basic bottom level introduction to rational philosophy for the average man on the street. And I'm trying to sort of fix two problems at once. I want to fix the fact that the objectivist movement in its current form often doesn't quite meet people at their values. There's a kind of a gap between where most people are and where the objectivist movement is. And people are either already somewhat on board, like I was, with these ideas and ready for it, or they don't know how to use reason. Even if they think of themselves as rational and logical, they don't understand how to apply that, how to use these ideas, and they're not ready to hear a lot of what objectivist speakers have to say. So I wanted to provide that introduction and also fix a problem with the self-development movement, because that was a big part of my transformation as well, was listening to people like, where do I start? People like Brian Rose, people like Ty Lopez, like some of them are a bit corny. People like Ryan Holiday, Tim Ferriss, people like that. And those people, even though not everything they said was true, in some cases, a lot of it was kind of snake oil, but not in the case of Tim Ferriss. I think he has a lot of good content, but in some of the others, like some of it was true, some of it wasn't, but it was all very inspiring. And there's this huge, like $50 billion self-help industry because people need answers to the questions of how to live their life and how to find happiness and success. And so much of that stuff is meaningless, rubbish. A lot of it is pure mysticism. You have books like The Secret, which sell in the million.
God, yeah, it's awful.
And I quote from that in my book, and just as a sort of platonic ideal of bad self-help, of this purely mystical advice. But even I was watching people like Alex and Mimi Icon, who are giving you a lot of good practical advice about, like, note keeping and meditating and stuff like that, but mixing it in with this kind of wishy-washy spiritualist stuff that isn't based in reality at all. And there's a huge gaping hole in the self-help movement for a rational answer, like a fact-based, logical answer to how to find happiness. So I want to do those two things at the same time, provide a really accessible, common man level introduction to objectivism that serves as a self-help book for self-help product for people who are rational, people who want a fact-based, evidenced approach to happiness that's not based on mysticism or, just pure pure nonsense, pure vacuous sort of rubbish that we get a lot of these days in self-help.
I look at objectivism in the books from Objectivism, Atlas Shrugged, Virtuous Selfishness, et cetera, as a self-help philosophy. And it seems that what you're saying is that there's deficits in the advancement of objectivism. There's deficits in the self-help movement. You want to address these deficits, integrate them, and merge them into a new message. What would you say, and you could address a little at a time if I'm asking too much, what would you say are the biggest deficits in the objectivist movement, in the self-help movement, and how do you plan to address those and integrate them?
So I think for a long time, since when Rand was alive, the objectivist movement has focused too much on politics and not enough on people's lives. And I think a lot of that probably goes back to the split between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, in the sense that he took with him a lot of the people who are interested in researching self-esteem and happiness and that side of the philosophy. And what was left in the objectivist movement was a lot more of people who are interested in politics. There's a lot of valuable work to do in that space, and I think a lot of what objectivist intellectuals from all the big organizations do in the politics space is valuable, is important. And I don't want to belittle any of that. I think it's valuable. But when a new person comes into one of these conferences or what picks up these videos on YouTube, a lot of the time it's super overwhelming for them. There's a huge context gap. And I've seen this with people who've come to all these conferences, including OSI's conferences as well as ARI's conferences, like all this stuff I've been to. It happens at libertarian events as well, LibDCon and places like that. Ordinary people come in and they're just hit with these ideas that are millions of miles outside their context of knowledge and experience. And you go directly from, I'm a little bit curious about what Ayn Rand had to say, to you're debunking climate change, you're debunking, you get people who are saying that Native Americans didn't have rights to their land and stuff like that. And it's just huge jumps in context. And it really, the two sort of things I just said are not even necessarily consistent or widespread objectivist opinions. They're just things you'll hear at these events. And I've seen people just get scared away. And these aren't people who are sort of dyed-in-the-wool irrationalists who we have no hope of ever bringing around to our ideas. They're people who have a rational perspective, or at least are trying to, but they're also coming out of public education in Britain or America or places like that, where you're surrounded for a long time by this context of the ideas I was talking about earlier, the ideas that education hits you with constantly while you're there. You spend 7 years in high school, 8 years, or whatever it is, wherever you are, just surrounded by this stuff. Everyone around you agrees with this stuff. And to have any of it challenged is a big shock. To have all of it challenged at once is hugely overwhelming. And it's very natural and very easy for people to just run away and say, this is a sort of bunch of crazy people and I don't want anything to do with it. I really want to help people along that journey, recognize the fact that it takes a long time to get from trying to be rational in today's society to accepting the whole of objectivist philosophy, or at least like the core tenets of objectivist philosophy. So, and I think leaving the politics out to begin with is a really big part of that, because until you've accepted the basic tenets of rationality, individualism, independent thought, you're not really ready yet to accept a lot of the political consequences of that. And I think far too many people come into the objectivist movement backwards, like politics first and get to the reason afterwards. And it's really important that you get the principles of reason and rationality down first. And then, like you said, objectivism is a self-development philosophy fundamentally. Ayn Rand called it a philosophy for living on Earth. It's a set of ideas for living the best life we can. And it has political implementations, because part of living the best life we can is having a society in which we can live the best lives we can, in which the government gets all the way off our backs and lets us flourish. But that is really secondary to the fundamental purpose of objectivism, which is to teach human beings how to live their lives in order that we can flourish and be happy and find meaning and achieve eudaimonia, to use Aristotle's concept, flourish and be ourselves as best we can. And so I really want to drive that aspect of objectivism much more strongly than I think has been done up until now. There have been people who've done a few attempts here and there, but I really want to adopt some lessons from the self-development industry in terms of how to run a brand in that world. And I've gone to a lot of events that these sort of people have run, and I don't want to go as corny as some of them do, but adopt more of that approach and try and get these ideas into ordinary people's minds. And I've done this for a couple of years now. I've got my book coming out and I'm really launching my brand this year, but I've been spreading these ideas a bit already for the last few years on my sort of in my own way. And I've already had a number of cases where I've just reframed people's ways of looking at their relationships, their jobs, and even if they're not on board with the political side of objectivism or even all of the sort of rejection of religion or those sorts of things, I've given them enough of a shock to set them off down that road and realize that there's so much more potential for happiness in their lives than they thought there was. And that's what happened to me. I was a student who was trying to avoid the 9-to-5 office environment by remaining in university and trying to please my family and please people and fit into society. And Ayn Rand showed me that I don't have to do any of that. It's moral for me to find my own happiness, find my own productive purpose, live my life on my own terms. And when you introduce people to that idea and say, look, you could be doing 45 different things if you work out what your values are, what achieving them means for you, and break out the idea that you have to fit into everyone else's box in how you live your life. It's world changing for them. But we've got to be patient and recognize that people need years to implement that and cash it out in their minds and come to all the conclusions, not expect them to instantly accept all the principles of our philosophy and sort of reject them if they don't, which I think happens to a lot of people who encounter these ideas.
So much of what you just said resonates with me. First of all, the focus on politics, because Ayn Rand, of course, her focus wasn't politics. She just said that she wanted to focus on politics until she didn't have to. Mm-hmm. But like, I want to focus on the type of stuff you're talking about. The trouble is, as a podcaster, I can't, but it's difficult to do that and not respond to current events, to what's actually occurring. So when I'm on social media and I want to see what people are talking about, people generally aren't talking about how to think more rationally, how to achieve moral perfection, how to build self-esteem. They're talking politics. And then I kind of feel like I have to address that stuff. And the other thing that I am guilty of, certainly, is when I'm talking to people, I come with this entire context and I just blast them with the whole context and not understand that they're not even at step one yet. And of course, it doesn't happen for us like that, right? We don't just absorb the entire objectivist canon by osmosis. For me, I started off with Milton Friedman and Frederick Bastiat's books, read some Austrian economics, then got to Ayn Rand and expand. And it's been now, 27 years or 26 years I've been reading this stuff. And for me to just expect somebody else to be exactly where I'm at right at this time. Like you said, you're talking about the Native American stuff, global warming stuff, and some of that stuff doesn't necessarily follow from objectivism. Like the Native American stuff just has to do with things that Ayn Rand said, not necessarily implications or conclusions that are entailed in the objectivist philosophy. But you talked about your own happiness and eudaimonia, and the name of your Substack, and I believe your upcoming book, is Reason for Living, right? Is that going to be the name of your book also? Why that title, Reason for Living?
So it has two meanings, essentially. On the one hand, there's the idea that reason is our path to happiness. Reason will enable us to live. So it's reason for living. Reason as a noun, essentially. If we adopt reason, we can live. And we're not really living at the moment as a society, as most people, and even those of us who do adopt this philosophy, we're really held back by not just the political context, but the social context we're living in as well. There's just a dearth of rationality around us, and there's nowhere near as much wealth intellectually, culturally, materially as there would be if we had a more rational culture around us. So on the one hand, it's saying reason is the means to live, our way of living. And then there's also a double meaning in the sense that reason gives us purpose. Reason gives us our reason for living, in the other meaning of the word reason. So, the way most people on the street will read the title is, a purpose to live, a purpose to live for. And reason can give you that. And there's a big chunk of this book, the middle two chapters are really dedicated to working out what your values are and building your value hierarchy. And that's the most transformative, in my experience, part of this process. When I speak to students and young people about these ideas, the part that really breaks their minds and makes them reframe their life is where I drive down into what are your values, what motivates you, what creates meaning in your life. Because a lot of people think, I like horses, I like rock music, I like whatever I like on a concrete level. They've never dug down into why do I like those things? What are the abstract values underlying that? And I spend a lot of time in this book helping people do that, which really reframes their minds. And by looking at your values in that kind of rational way, trying to measure and quantify what you, not quantify like mathematically, but like get a clear idea and an organized structure to what you value and why, can really give you purpose in life. So sort of reason to live in the sense that, and life, it's really important when we talk about objectivism and life, because life is such an important concept in objectivism. Life does not just mean being alive. Like that isn't human life, and Aristotle recognized this. Human life is not just the state of being conscious. It's the action of being a human fully, like the active condition of existing as a human being thoughtful, conscious, active, pursuing meaning, producing things. That's what living means. If you're not doing those things, you're not living. So this is reason to go out there and live, not just reason to stay alive. And that's important in the political side as well. If we're going to talk about a right to life, we don't mean just a right to be alive. Like, that's a misunderstanding of that, because then you can start going into like a right to food and stuff. It means a right to live your life, a right to be a human being, to use your mind, to choose values, pursue them. And unfortunately, part of what motivated me to get more active in promoting these ideas was my experience during the COVID lockdowns, where, in the interest of saving lives, which has big scare quotes on it for anyone listening on audio, we basically shut down life. We stopped people from living. And that was completely contradictory. To give some people who are in very bad situations already a few extra months in a bed in a horrible state of suffering, we shut down everybody's lives. Young people couldn't go to school, people couldn't run businesses. It just destroyed value left, right, and center, and actually led to a lot of suicides as well. And that made me realize, I at the time I was very focused on innovation and technology in my brand, in my sort of personal work. And I was like, no, I need to go deeper than this. Like, I'm interested in technology because I want to see a sort of flourishing Star Trek future. But to achieve that, I need to change the culture on a much deeper level. I need to get people to appreciate human life, what human life is supposed to be, get people living, producing, thinking. And so I wanted to project the opposite of what we saw during lockdown. I wanted to present a situation where human activity is increased 100-fold, where people are living 100 times more, not less, and the kind of flourishing world that would produce.
You have a very good Substack. I was reading a bunch of the articles today. Can you tell us some of the topics that you address? And there's one in particular that I want to talk to you about, but I want to give you a chance to just talk about the various things you address.
Sure. Yeah, I somewhat do the Substack based on the book. So each of my Substack articles, or most of them anyway, is expanding on a particular idea in the book. So there's one I did recently that did really well in terms of people's reaction to it, which was about separating reason from rationalism or rationalization. And there's several different layers to this, really, but a lot of people will have an idea that they already hold, whether it's super clear in their heads or not. They'll have some assumption. It might be about ethics. It might be an idea like you have a duty to your family, or you should respect your elders, or you owe it something to your country, things like that. Or it might be a metaphysical idea, like it could be God existing, it could be spirits having independent existence from us, or something like that. It could be an idea that somebody's accepted for a long time, or since a young age, and they will look for so-called rational explanations for that idea, like arguments in support of it, and they'll come to the conclusion that they believe this idea based on evidence because they've got evidence for it as they see it. They've got arguments and reasoning, but they've actually gone through the process backwards. They've sort of done reverse reasoning. They've started from a conclusion and reasoned backwards from it and looked for explanations for it. And that's the opposite of the proper approach to reason. The proper approach to reason, what reason truly is looking at reality, deriving information, inducing information from reality, integrating that information together, checking it again against reality, integrating further, adding in more information, more experience as we get more experience of the world around us, testing theories against the reality, checking again. And that's reason in the right direction. Reason is the process of starting from reality and deriving ideas from it. And most people don't have that approach. Most people have a sort of loose collection of ideas that they've never really challenged, that they then look for information that supports. And so that was one important thing, because when you start approaching it that way, you start challenging a lot of your own preconceptions. And I'm still going through this process as well. Like, I don't think anyone ever gets to a stage where they stop doing that. I think even Rand herself probably still had ideas in her mind that she hadn't rationally processed. I think all of us will do for all of our lives. But if you can get to a situation like Rand did, where 99.9% of your thinking is reality oriented, you can thrive and succeed the way she did in her life. And the way that people who implement her ideas, like Steve Ditko and Jimmy Wales and people like that, have done, where they've built amazing businesses, flourishing lives for themselves. Even if you're always going to be learning, and I think a sort of crucial conceit to get away from is the idea that you ever reach a point that you stop learning, where you've basically worked everything out. There's always more learning to do, but a lot of people just haven't even started on that road yet. So that's one thing, is sort of teaching the principles of rational thinking. I'm trying to fill a gap that school fails to fill. Like, schools don't teach rational thinking, critical thinking. They just teach facts or things that are presented as facts that you then have to regurgitate in an exam, not think about, chew, process in your mind. So I'm trying to fill that gap and help people do that with their ideas, with their values, with their thoughts about family and careers and relationships and things like that.
The article that I'm talking about that stood out to me is the one you wrote about how the movies we watch impact us. When I started reading self-help books, before I even ended up incarcerated, I read self-help books for a while and then put them down and then started reading them again. But one of the messages that they talk about, there's a saying, and I don't know who to attribute it to, who said it, but that he could tell you where a person would be a year from now, judging by the books the person read and the people he hung around. Because the environment impacts us in ways that we're not even aware of. It just, you pick up on things, people's mannerisms, habits of talking, ways of looking at the world, especially if you're not actively engaged in the reality process, the reasoning process that you just mentioned. So when you're talking about how movies have subtle messages that impact us, that really resonated with me. What can you tell us about that? I mean, you use Star Wars as an example, so you can talk about that if you want, and why we should be careful with what we watch, but also aware of why we like what we like and dislike what we dislike.
Yeah, so movies and TV shows convey ideas on several different levels. There's the explicit ideas that something might convey through what the characters say on screen, and say for a book, like, what the characters actually say, or sort of one level down from that is what the events convey. So, if the good guy wins and the bad guy loses, there's a very obvious message of, like, being virtuous, heroic is efficacious and successful, being villainous isn't. So you watch a James Bond movie, it's not very philosophic, but you get a general message of, if you're the good guys, you win, which is a nice message to celebrate. Plus, whatever throwaway line that James Bond says about, for England or whatever. But movies also, and TV shows and even video games, they also convey ideas on a much more subtle level. So Ayn Rand called art a selective recreation of reality, based on the artist's metaphysical value judgments. And that's a long way of saying that art is a process of choosing what to include in the artwork. And those choices convey something about your view of the world, in your fundamental view of the world. Not just your political ideology, but like whether or not you think that life is purposeful, life is generally benevolent and good. And you can see this really clearly in some examples. So I said I grew up as a Star Trek fan. If you watch Star Trek from the 60s to the 2000s, like from Gene Roddenberry's era through to Rick Berman's era, so the original Star Trek through to the sort of Enterprise era, the whole philosophy of that period of Star Trek is that we're setting aside like bits of socialist politics or whatever. The general philosophy of Star Trek is that human beings will succeed. We will overcome our problems. We will get out there into the universe. We will flourish. Our technology will help us flourish. Technology is a force for good. Like, this is implicit in every episode of Star Trek, practically. We fix injuries with a little machine. We fly around the universe, spreading our good philosophy and stuff like that. It's very benevolent, very positive. A diametric opposite to that is Game of Thrones. If you read or watch Game of Thrones, the whole philosophy that George R.R. Martin has explicitly conveyed in interviews, as well as through the show and through the books, is that humans are debaucherous. We're all horribly flawed. All we care about is sex and violence. We just want to kill and rape each other. And that's all that will ever happen in human society, is that we just constantly have wars and constantly violate and ruin each other's lives and destroy values. And that there's basically no hope in existence. And the reason that a lot of people hate the end of the TV show is when the TV show writers took over in the last 2 seasons, it went in this completely different direction, and it did try and give it like a nice TV show ending where there's a bit more of, although it had that horrific Daenerys kills everyone bit first, but then it tried to wrap it up with a nice, and it just completely was off key for what that show had been up until that point. And Martin doesn't really like concluding stories because he doesn't really believe in conclusions. He just believes in this endless progression of human suffering almost. So the whole sense of life of that show is negative and deadly, really. And I really admire the TV show of Game of Thrones for its cinematography. It's beautifully made. It's an excellent piece of art on a technical level. But if you watch it and don't very carefully analyze what it's saying to you subconsciously as well as explicitly, you'll very easily fall victim to this sort of pessimistic, nihilistic worldview. And I can feel it happening to me. The same thing happens if I watch the 2003 version of Battlestar Galactica. Like, it's a show that very much presents this cycle of suffering that humans are stuck in. It's actually explicit. If you get to the end of the Battlestar Galactica reboot, there's actually, like, in the final episode, there's an explicit implication that we're stuck in a cycle of making the same mistakes over and over again. And it's much better to seek out something that, regardless of what it is, it might not be science fiction, which is obviously what I love. I also love detective shows. Like shows like Inspector Morse, which is a British detective show from the late 80s and early 90s, where it's all about like the power of the mind to solve problems. We can find bad guys using thought. We can think through what they're doing, untangle their problems in a very intellectual way in that show, more so than other detective shows or stories as well. But even something like Sherlock Holmes, even a show like Bones, like, you know, just a fairly basic, it might have a lot of bad science in it, but the general message of it is benevolent. And that's really the most important thing to look for in any artwork. Unfortunately, people don't do that. I used to go to a lot of movies with sort of friends in my city who are not philosophic people. They're just like ordinary people, accountants and stuff. And I would go to a movie and come out and ask them afterwards, what did you think of that? And they'll say, oh, yeah, I like the battle sequence. I like this guy's acting. They'll never say anything about the message or the meaning or the values in it. And I'll say, you know, what do you think? What values do you think it conveyed? What ideas do you think it could be? What did you think of what the story said to you? So I tried different wordings, and it was always just blank confusion. Like they hadn't thought of that at all. And there are some movies out there. There's a movie called Knock at the Cabin a few years ago, which I wrote a review of in the Objective Standards, because it explicitly at the end of the movie conveyed the idea that you should sacrifice the people you love for the so-called greater good. And people will watch that movie and think it's just a horror movie and not realize that there's this subliminal message that's comes through. There's a group of film reviewers based out of Milwaukee called Red Letter Media, and in some of their reviews they say this thing that there's something in the movie that you didn't notice but your brain did. And there's a lot of that in art, I think, where there's stuff that you subconsciously notice even if you don't consciously notice it. And so I want people to be more consciously attentive to those things, to the things that slip in under the radar. Ideologically, it happens in other respects as well. There are sort of visual things that do that too, but specifically in terms of the ideas in a story, the things that you might unwittingly accept. To give one last example, when we think about things in life that we don't encounter day to day very often, but we see in movies a lot. Things like the police, for example. Like we don't often have very many encounters with the police in our real lives, but we see it in the movies all the time. And so, especially in Europe, I think, it's probably true in the US as well. Like there's a perception that American police just like whip out their guns at the slightest provocation and are just like super violent. And I think that's almost entirely because of how they're depicted in movies and the media. Like most people's conception of how the police behave, and the same with the army and like militaries everywhere. The idea that Mexico is this like, smoky hot place where everyone's like a gangster and a criminal. Again, there's some truth, reality that's based on. It does have a huge crime problem, but that's not what life in Mexico is actually like. So, there's a lot of stuff like that where we just implicitly accept the way movies teach us the world is on a concrete level or on a more abstract level, in terms of even like the Marvel movies with all the multiverse stuff that's in the Marvel movies at the moment. We start to accept this idea that like, if somebody dies, maybe they're still alive in another world. It's like, that's actually quite a destructive idea to accept. Like we need to take human life seriously, consequences seriously. So I really want people to just very consciously pay attention to the ideas that are implicit in the selections that are made in a movie or a TV show.
In my introduction to psychology course, they talked about primary and secondary processing. And primary processing is basically what you said, that your brain is understanding the messages, even if you aren't. It's just, you basically take things at face value, you process them, you some sense of integration and kind of move on. Whereas secondary processing is when you actually stop, think, consider what's going on. And to me, the secondary processing is a vital part of life. Now, obviously, it's like with art, you have to select out what you're going to choose to do and what you're going to, choose to put your effort in. So it's not a good idea for me to use secondary processing every time I tie my shoes or go for a walk. But there are instances, a lot of them, where it is vital. And I think when we're contemplating the messages that we're getting and how those messages are affecting us from movies, TV, music, the media, whatever, I think that's very, very important. And I think the work you're doing is, by the way, is great. So I want to ask you, 5, 10, 15 years from now, if you're a success, what would you have accomplished?
Oh, that's a big question. So a lot of what I want to accomplish is empowering other people to accomplish things. Like I want to scale my own productive capacity to empower lots of other people to then achieve things that will improve my life in return. So I will consider my work a success if like one person I coach or who reads my book or something goes on to do, found a Google X Prize, found a SpaceX, like do that kind of transformative impact. Whatever people may say about Elon Musk, whatever he may say, like I think he's a hero in a lot of important respects. The work he's done in human spaceflight, especially, is going to enormously improve human flourishing in the future. Like if somebody can do something like that, and my ideas can help somebody who might have just sat in an office all their lives otherwise do something like that, that's so meaningful to me. I also get a lot of meaning from just unleashing the potential of a person who deserves to be happy to be happy. Like that's a value to me. Like I don't altruistically want to just make people happy all over the place for no reason. I want to take people who have the kind of minds, the kind of curious, rational, active minds who should be succeeding and give them the tools to succeed. And if I then see that happening, that's a huge value to me. It's like people who deserve happiness, people who are curious minded, achieving that happiness is a huge value to me. On a personal level with the business, like I want to be running huge events, seminars. Like I want to be getting these ideas on TV, spread throughout the culture. If I could try and eclipse what Rhonda Byrne did with The Secret with rational ideas, like that would be huge for me. And I'm not saying I'm going to jump to that kind of level of success. I'm quite happy to tick along at a more kind of moderate level for the time being, as long as I'm changing lives, as long as I'm helping people do something transformative. And I've sort of chosen a career in which I'm very focused on ideas. I'm a thinker by trade, and I thought to myself, I could switch paths. I could go into something more concrete, more physically productive, rather than producing books. I could try and go into research in science or technology or something like that. The way my brain works, I'm not very mathematical. I tend to suck at those sorts of things. And so I thought, okay, I can be a cog in somebody else's machine and help them produce some material value. Or I can turbocharge the ability of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to produce values instead. And some of those people will produce intellectual value like I'm doing, and they'll turbocharge more people besides. And some of them will produce practical values and whatever. Like that's the value to me, is empowering people to succeed, empowering people to thrive. And ultimately, I want those people to then come back and create a world where I can flourish more, whether it's by inventing a technology or maybe they innovate an idea. It might be that they then have a development on what I've written or what Rand's written that I introduced them to that gives me more clarity in how to achieve happiness and how to think about my values. Like that would be epic. I would love that. I'd love to be, what Aristotle was to Plato, like the guy who like tidies up and fixes your ideas. So that would be fantastic. The more of that I could do, the better. Like I just want to scale that. I just want to have people who come up to me, and I've had this happen, and it's phenomenal when it happens. And if it could happen a lot more, I'd be a lot happier. When people come up to me and say, thank you, you made me realize I was on the wrong path in life. I left my university course and went and did something that means something to me, or I left this bad relationship or something like that. And a human being is flourishing who deserves to flourish, who wouldn't have done it if I hadn't introduced them to these ideas. That's what really gets me going in this line of work.
That's phenomenal. Well, I'm going to include a link to your Substack and a link to your book so people can read your Substack, purchase your book. Where else can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Substack. I'm on Instagram as well, RFL_reason for living. Unfortunately, @reason for living was taken, so it's got RFL_ at the front of it. But you can follow me on Instagram. On there, I put little reels up occasionally talking about these same ideas that I talk about on the Substack. I'm on YouTube as well. The OSI marketers are always telling me to do more video content, so I'm trying to do more of that as well, longer form videos. But most importantly, the book is available for pre-order on Kindle on Amazon right now. The print copy will be available on Amazon on the 8th of April. And so we'll hopefully an audiobook version if I can get that done in time. And also I have a book tour coming up. That's the other thing to mention, is that I'm doing some live events. I'm going to be at Level Up Europe in Sofia. I'm going to be at LibertyCon in Prague. And I'm also going to do a talk in Prague before that. And then I'm going to come over to the US, doing a private event in Charlotte. But if anyone's in that area, let me know and I can see if we can get you in on that. And then an event in Austin, Texas. And I'll be at Level Up in Orlando, Florida. And then I've got some events in London coming up as well. And also, if you're interested in these ideas and want me to talk about them to like a group of friends or an organization you have in your area, let me know. I'd love to come visit and do that if it's possible. I want to do as much of this kind of stuff. But yeah, if I would love to come and talk at conferences, events, whatever you've got. If you run it could be a little meetup, it could be a huge conference. I would love to come and speak at it. Bring the book, bring my ideas. So please reach out, Thomas at reason-for-living.com. Or just through the Substack comment section, and we can get in touch.
Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Cool, thanks.
And thank you for what you're doing. It's really phenomenal, like I said.
Back at you. You're spreading these ideas too, and that's awesome. Thanks.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.